Good evening. Welcome to the Baker Institute for Public Policy at the Rice University. This evening, we are honored to host Dr. Marc Lynch to discuss post-Arab Spring developments in the Middle East based on his new book, The New Arab Wars, Anarchy and Uprising in the Middle East. As we're going through an interesting election cycle here in the US, the Middle East appears to be at the center of foreign policy debates. President Obama is often criticized for minimizing American footprint in the region and blamed for the current chaos in the region. Presidential candidates from both parties have been criticized in different ways for not having coherent and effective strategies to deal with the fallout from the Arab Spring that began 6 years ago. But don't you worry, we got you covered. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Lynch, has been observing this unfolding of the protests, revolutions, and wars in the Middle East for a long time. Beyond his academic credentials, he's in a position to speak to the policy world and the administration with his ongoing conversations with them. He's one of the rare people whose analysis and insights into the developments in the Middle East is borne by the unfolding of the events in the region. Marc's new book, The New Arab Wars, is an insightful read that draws from both scholarly literature and the social media social media world. Yet it doesn't have these scholarly pretensions that we are accustomed to seeing in academic works. It is a genuine read. In this book, Marc rethinks and reevaluates the assumptions and arguments that shaped our understanding of the earlier phase of the Arab Spring developments. Marc helps us understand this big swing in the Arab world. In his own words, only a few years ago, the Arab world seemed poised to escape decades of autocratic misrule and state violence. Today, the hopes of millions of Arab citizens who heroically took to the streets demanding change have faded. As such, the book tells the story of the subversion of the Arab Spring uprising from a regional perspective. It emphasizes the connections between the many complex local political battles and places them within a broader political war over regional order. This book is available for purchase in the rear of the Commons, and Marc will be happy to sign them at the end of the talk. Marc is one of the most decorated experts on Middle Eastern politics. He's a graduate of Duke University and Cornell University for undergraduate and graduate degrees, respectively. After teaching several years at Williams College, he moved to George Washington University in 2007 and currently serves as professor of political science in the Department of Political Science, the Elliott School of International Affairs, and School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Until last year, he served as the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. He's named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow earlier this year. Currently, Marc is the director of the Project on Middle East Political Science, the major outlet for political scientists who work on Middle East and connect with the broader public. He serves as a contributing editor to the Monkey Cage blog at the Washington Post and as the series editor for Columbia Studies in Middle East Politics of Columbia University Press. Previously, he blogged as Ebu Aardvark in his own blog, and later on, he joined the Middle East channel of Foreign Policy magazine. Marc has several books: State Interests and Public Spheres, The International Politics of Jordan's Identity, Voices of the New Arab Republic, Iraq, Al Jazeera, and Middle East Politics Today, The Arab Uprising, The Unfinished Revolutions of the Middle East, The Arab Uprising Explained, New Contentious Politics in the Middle East, and lastly, The New Arab Wars, Anarchy and Uprising in the Middle East. I won't go into journal articles he's published. I don't think we have time for that, and sorry, Marc, we have to stop here. He's the recipient of several substantial grants from organizations and agencies such as Henry Luce Foundation, U.S. Institute for Peace, Carnegie Corporation, U.S. Department of Education, and Social Science Research Council. So I think that's about it. I'll stop here, and please welcome Dr. Marc Lynch.
Thanks, Qadir, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many people here to talk about the Middle East. As you know from having walked in the front door, I do have a fairly recent book that has just come out, The New Arab Wars, and so I'm mostly going to talk about that. But what I want to do is to talk about that book in the context of this kind of the broader evolution of the Middle East. And then I thought what I would do is try and, since we are where we are, half an hour out of the election, I thought it might be of interest towards the end of the talk to talk a little bit about what we might expect from the next administration, whoever it might be, just to get a sense of how the kinds of things that I'll be talking about for the first half hour of the talk are likely to be affecting and be affected by what's going to happen in Washington in about 4 months. But let me, to start off though, let me just start with the very basic and I think obvious to anyone who pays attention to the Middle East, the very obvious point that things there are a real mess. It's hard to exaggerate how bad things are in the Middle East right now, almost across the board. Even in the countries that are more or less holding it together, where you haven't seen state collapse or state failure, you have a really kind of grim sense of declining opportunities and hopes, of more repressive regimes, of struggling economies. The collapse of oil prices has been very unkind to most of the countries in the Gulf, but also even the non-oil producing countries, which depend very heavily on the Gulf states for support. In some countries where you saw very real and very, in my view, very optimistic processes of democratic transition, you've seen those collapse in a military coup in Egypt, in civil war in Yemen, in civil war in Libya, and then even the one great, glorious, shining hope, Tunisia, which is the great shining hope. I love Tunisia. Everyone loves Tunisia. Everybody wants Tunisia to succeed. But even Tunisia, which, as I'll explain in a few moments, has navigated the last 5 years better than almost any other Arab country, even Tunisia's not doing so great. And that's our best hope. And the worst part, of course, is those states that have completely collapsed into incredibly violent civil wars with almost unbelievable humanitarian implications. Right now, there are 3 or 4, depending on how you count, active wars going on, which have completely torn apart those states. Libya has gone from an attempted democratic transition into a civil war, which has basically completely torn apart the country as a country, and has led to what many people fear is going to be the semi-permanent destruction of Libya as a viable state. Yemen is divided into a civil war, which is now the target of an ongoing campaign, a military campaign, a bombing campaign carried out by Saudi Arabia and its allies. And then, of course, Syria is the epicenter of human suffering in many ways, probably the single most important center of global conflict right now, not only for the region, but globally. And it's become the producer of some of the most unbelievable and horrible scenes that you're going to see anywhere. It's a situation now in Syria where you have more than half of the country's population, some 13 million people, are displaced, 500,000 people have been killed, entire cities have been destroyed, the significant portion of the country has been captured by the so-called Islamic State, and it basically has become the epicenter of a large-scale proxy war in which regional powers from Iran to Saudi Arabia to Qatar to Turkey are all fighting on Syrian soil, as are Russia, and most likely quite soon the United States. And so this is a very grim place for the region to be. And the reason I wanted to start off by emphasizing how horrible things are is because what makes it so tragic is that only 5 years ago, things seemed much more hopeful. And in fact, if all the story was that things in the Middle East are difficult and bad, it actually wouldn't be that much of a story. I think most of us are accustomed to thinking about the Middle East as an area full of authoritarian repressive regimes, violence, conflict, and the like. That's not a new story, except for the fact that 5 years ago, it seemed to many people, including me, that for the first time in a very, very long time, there was a real possibility of moving beyond that, of transforming the Middle East from within into something very, very different. So this book that is out there right now, The New Arab Wars, is in some ways a sequel to a book that I wrote in late 2011 and which was published in early 2012 called The Arab Uprising. And that book, and they're very similar, I think, in terms of what I tried to do, in the sense that what I tried to do in each of the books was to give a full regional story, to try and tell what was happening in the Middle East, not as a series of loosely connected vignettes, not simply telling a story of this is happening in Egypt and this is happening in Libya, but to tell it as a single story of a region-wide challenge to entrenched authority, a region-wide uprising, and then a region-wide struggle for power and influence. But the tone and the tenor of the books are entirely different in many ways, because in 2011, this was a story which was, in many ways, a story of positive change, a story of hope, a story of the breaking through of entrenched autocracy and this new generation which seemed to be doing fundamentally new things. And that book was very much about looking at a vista of possible transformation, looking at what had happened to make it possible for people to rise up and challenge things which they had been unable to challenge for generations. But that book actually ended on a fairly pessimistic and cautious note. What I observed in the book was that for all of the enthusiasm and all the excitement of early 2011, history told us, going back to the long span of modern Middle Eastern history, that each time we had seen this kind of large-scale mass mobilization challenging states and pushing for something new, we had ended up with those states pushing back, reestablishing themselves, and ending up with more repressive, more authoritarian, and more violent states at the end of that process. Whether we're talking about the 1950s, the 1970s, the early 1990s, the story was largely similar. Every 20 years or so, you would have large-scale mass uprisings and mass mobilization, which would end in something worse. And so the conclusion of the Arab Uprising, which again was written in late 2011, came out in early 2012, said that judging by history and judging by the real distribution of power in the region, power, interest, and kind of established, entrenched institutions, that's what we should expect to see again. That the hopes of the protesters would be frustrated. The attempt to change would fail. And that we would end up with a reassertion and re-entrenchment of state power. But I tried to end that book on a note of hope, because I said that it really did seem to me that there was something different this time. And that thing that was different was, broadly speaking, generational change and the forces of globalization. And my own research pointed me in the direction of information technology, satellite media, satellite television, the internet, social media, the whole span of things which gave this new rising generation not just, kind of the different lived experience and different horizons, but also gave them power in ways that they had not had power before. That social media, handheld phones like this one, put power in their hands that allowed them to challenge states on their own terrain in terms of mobilizing power and in terms of resisting many of the old ways of repression, control, and coercion. And so the way I described the situation in the Middle East in late 2011 was it was basically a race between two competing trends. The cyclical trend of history, which would suggest failure, and this more secular trend of the empowerment of a new generation using the tools of globalization in order to challenge the old ways of doing business and find ways to establish new types of governance, new state-society relations, a new bargain which would get rid of the old authoritarianism and replace it with something which might not be kind of Western-style liberal democracy, but would be something new and something different. And it was a race. Could you see these new forces establish new forms of governance, successful democratic consolidation, and the pushing back of state repression before they were defeated? And at the time, I basically saw it as roughly a 50-50 proposition because I was hopeful then. But unfortunately, what we've seen is essentially that they failed and they lost, and that the cyclical pattern of history turned out to be a better predictor of what was to come than the hopes of transformation, globalization, and generational change. And so, in a sense, my new book is the mirror image of the first one, in that the story that it tells is an exceedingly depressing one. It's an exceedingly tragic one, which recounts in considerable detail how things went wrong and how this happened. But it's also a mirror image in the sense that it ends on perhaps a more optimistic note and a more hopeful note than the preceding 250 pages would merit. In the sense that I genuinely believe that what's happening in the Middle East and what we've been living through for the last 5 years is part of a generational transformation, and that it really is not possible for the Middle East to go back to the way it was in 2010, even though all of the regimes in the region, and frankly, most of the elites in the region, would like to do so. In other words, I think where we are now is not the end point of a 5-year-long process of failed revolution, but very much in the midpoint of a 20 to 30 year long process of the erosion and failure of an authoritarian and state populist mode of governance, which has been utterly, fundamentally hollowed out, has been eviscerated, and that what we see now is a reassertion of stability and authoritarian rule, which looks stable, but it isn't. And that we're looking, and the smart money should be on sometime in the next 2 to 5 years, the eruption of another round of significant, serious popular mobilization, state failure, and protest, but with no guarantees that this leads in the direction of democracy or hope, but very much in the direction of state failure and conflict. So it's not totally hopeful, but it's also not in the direction of saying that a story has ended. So what I want to do is very quickly, so I want to be sure to leave plenty of time for people to ask questions, because what I'm going to have to do by necessity is skate over a large number of quite complex internal domestic politics and issues, because I'm trying to tell a story of an entire region. So by design, I'm going to be skating over a lot of very complicated things very quickly, and then I want to leave time for you to ask about the countries or issues that you care about. But I want to give a broad framework for understanding what went wrong and why we went down this road instead of the other road, why we went down the road of failure rather than success, or the reassertion of state repression instead of transformation. And I would say that, broadly speaking, in the narratives that you read in the media and the newspapers, but also from the region itself, there's a couple of forces which tend to get the lion's share of the blame. If you ask people what went wrong and how things failed, I would say that there's 3 answers that you'll get more often than any other. The first is that it was a failure of the activists themselves, that the Egyptian activists failed to get their act together. They didn't form political parties. They kept protesting instead of getting involved in democratic politics. They miscalculated relative to their rivals. And all of those things are true. They made horrible mistakes that many of them will now frankly admit to. But the thing to remember, though, is that the activists in every one of the arenas that I'm about to talk about were universally the weakest party involved. These were individuals and networks which managed to harness an unbelievable and unprecedented amount of power in early 2011 by getting millions of people into the streets simultaneously and being able to press demands which they had never been able to press before. But fundamentally, they were weak. They had no shared ideology, they had no established institutions, they had no social base, which meant that relative to groups like the military, to the Muslim Brotherhood, to the organized powers in the region, they were fundamentally weak. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with an explanation that blames outcomes on the weakest party rather than on the stronger parties. The activists certainly failed, and I make no excuses for them, but I don't think they're the reason why the Arab Spring failed. The next group that gets the lion's share of blame is the Muslim Brotherhood. And a kind of, not just in Egypt, but across the region. The idea that the Islamists were unready for democracy, they were power hungry, they were totalitarian in their orientation, and that fundamentally they hijacked what should have been a democratic transition and turned it into something else, and that you have to blame them for the failure of the Arab Spring. And once again, I make no excuses for the Muslim Brotherhood. Their 1 year in power in Egypt was absolutely disastrous, mismanaged in every way, and I think they did an extraordinarily bad job in an historic moment. I have no question about that at all. But once again, I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood was the leading actor or the primary actor that drove things off the brink. They were a player, but not the primary one, and I'll explain why in a moment. The third that you'll often hear is Obama, that it's something about American policy, that Obama didn't do this or he did do that. And this, I think, is pretty much totally wrong, that I think that the United States is a marginal player in much of the story that's about to unfold, whether correctly or incorrectly. It's a force which we in the United States, and especially me living in Washington, where we live and breathe this stuff and we can't get away from it, we tend to radically overestimate America's importance in these events, which were primarily domestic and regional in nature, and that a whole lot is projected onto American policy where it really doesn't belong. But I just remember sitting in Washington in late January, early February 2011, and having people talk about how Obama needed to issue a statement in order to, resolve the crisis in Egypt, and just thinking how insane this was. There were millions of people in the streets occupying the central square, not just in Cairo, but in almost every city in Egypt, burning down police stations and completely, doing what was a revolutionary thing for them. And the idea that they would have gone home because Obama told them to was just crazy. And yet, I think a lot of people in Washington believed this because of this internalized notion that the United States is always at the center of events. And in most of what the story that I'm about to tell, they really weren't. They did have an effect on the margins at key moments, most powerful player, important player across the region, but not the driver of what was going on. So, if it's not the Muslim Brothers, it's not Obama, it's not the activists, who's to blame? And here, you do a combination of kind of basic deductive work, which is basically, number one, in whose interest is it for the Arab Spring to fail? And number two, capabilities. Who has the capabilities to kill it? And that, I think the answer is pretty obvious. It was the regimes that were threatened, who were primarily to blame for the death of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring that we see as a popular uprising for democracy, for freedom, for liberty, for really wonderful things, from the point of view of Arab regimes, was an existential and mortal threat because they were in power and they didn't want to give that power up. I think that's a natural thing for people in power. In the Middle East, I would go so far as to say that staying in power is almost the only thing which most Arab leaders care about. It's the thing they prioritize over everything else. And the idea that they would be removed from power is the single most urgent thing which shapes their foreign policy and their domestic policy decisions. The Arab Spring was a mortal existential threat to their survival, and it was treated as such. When the United States embraced the idea of the Arab Spring, even though I don't believe that it caused any of the outcomes in Egypt or any place else, this was something which, from the point of view of the Gulf states, of Jordan, of the other Arab leaders in the region, this was deeply alarming and deeply frightening. Because, again, put yourself in their shoes. If the story is that 1 million people come into the streets, occupy the central square, and demand that the president step down, and that president is a 30-year-long ally of the United States and is one of America's closest allies in the region, and the American response is, we feel that it's time for the president to step down. Now, that might be the right policy, and in my view, it was the right policy in Egypt, but from the point of view of other leaders in the Middle East, it signaled that the same thing could happen to them. and that if 1 million people came and occupied their central squares, that they couldn't count on the United States to somehow make the threat go away. Now, again, from my point of view, that's a good thing. I think most of these regimes are very much deserving of not being in power anymore. But from their point of view, they wanted to stay in power. And they could not count, from their perspective, on either the passivity of their own people or on the United States to bail them out, should they be threatened. And so the story that this book tells is largely about the counterattack by regimes who felt threatened by the Arab uprisings and how they went about trying to stay in power and how they responded to the Arab Spring. And sometimes they were fairly unified and they worked together in concert in self-preservation. At other times, they were obsessed with competing with each other, and they often had extraordinarily destructive influence in various arenas that I'll talk about in a moment. But I would say that in all cases, they were motivated primarily by this fundamental desire to stay in power at any cost, and that this then led them to take a whole series of policy actions which have shaped the Middle East into what it is today. Now let me walk through this very quickly, how this unfolds. So when the Arab Spring begins, for those of you who you want to go back and get a general reminder of the timeline, it starts in Tunisia. Tunisia is an extremely marginal country in terms of the broad, big picture of Middle Eastern politics, both geographically and politically. And when the Tunisian Revolution broke out, it took everyone by surprise, but nobody really thought, at least in the elite circles, that it would travel beyond Tunisia. When President Ben Ali fled and sought refuge in Saudi Arabia, this was a really quite alarming thing to Arab leaders, and it was inspirational to people around the region. It's almost impossible now to recapture how feverish it was at that moment. The way that Ben Ali stepping down from power peacefully led people to believe for the first time in their lives, the first time ever, that they might actually be able to bring about political change through popular mobilization. An incredibly powerful idea which mobilized people, inspired them, and I think is absolutely necessary for what happens next, the Tunisian example. But it wasn't obvious right at the start. On January 14th, it was not obvious that this was going to spread. And in fact, most of the official Arab media and most of the Arab regimes believed that it wouldn't, that what started in Tunisia would stay in Tunisia. Nobody could save Ben Ali. His traditional allies couldn't save him. It all happened too fast, and nobody was prepared to save him. But then, when it spread to Egypt. Tunisia was marginal, Egypt was central. Egypt was the absolute center of the geopolitical structure of the Middle East regional order. Strong American ally, but also the core of the Saudi-led regional order. Very strong ally of Israel, very strong ally of Saudi Arabia, strong ally of the United States. The strategic depth of the regional order as it had been constructed since 1990, 1991, and nurtured and sustained over the years. When the protests spread to Egypt, this was not like Tunisia. In Tunisia, you could imagine change happening and it not really mattering very much. In Egypt, the stakes were enormously high, and they were understood as such by all sides. Now, I don't have time here to go through the exciting story of the Egyptian Revolution, although I'm happy to if you'd like later. But suffice it to say that in 18 days, you get from Mubarak being essentially the eternal and unshakable leader of Egypt to his being removed from power through a largely peaceful process of popular mobilization. Now, his removal from power came at the hands of the military. It was not an actual revolution in the sense of there actually being a new set of elites coming in and taking power. This was part of the defensive strategy of the regional order. By removing Mubarak, but putting the military in charge, the fundamental nature of Egypt, at least from a regional politics dimension, didn't change. So Mubarak was gone, but the idea of Egypt as a core part of the regional order, an ally of Saudi Arabia, United States, Israel, and a core part of what it had always been didn't change. And that's an extremely important part of what follows in the coming period. But Mubarak's departure really did trigger existential fears every place else, and existential hopes on the streets and existential fears in the palaces. The galvanizing effect beyond Egypt was, again, really something to behold. Tunisia got people excited. Egypt got people out into the streets, and you had simultaneous mobilization in almost every single Arab country. It's become popular today to say, well, the monarchies avoided mobilization, and the republics faced crowds, and it's just false. It's just not empirically right. Kuwait had the largest popular protest in its history. Oman had the largest labor actions and popular protests in its history. Bahrain had more than half of the citizen population of the country in the streets protesting, the largest single per capita protest anywhere in the Middle East. Morocco and Jordan both had large and sustained protest movements. Almost every country in the Middle East had large, sustained protest movements after February 2011. The regional order, the major powers of the region, saw this as the existential threat, which in fact it was, and they responded in the book I lay this out as a series of progressive, almost concentric circles set of responses. So the first response was essentially to protect the home front, to make sure that the protests would not spread to their own soil. Now, for some of those countries, this was very easy. Qatar and the UAE had nothing to worry about. They're extremely rich, extremely powerful, strong, repressive states. They faced very little popular mobilization, didn't have to do much. They were fine. Saudi Arabia had much more reason for concern. Saudi Arabia, despite its vast wealth, has large reservoirs of poverty, significant internal political problems, roiling, ongoing protest in the eastern province of its predominantly Shia population in the eastern province. Saudi Arabia was taking no chances, and then King Abdullah, moved very quickly and aggressively to make sure that Saudi Arabia would not face a Mubarak moment. And this was a combination of repression, arresting protesters preemptively or dissidents preemptively, and also a lot of co-optation. Large-scale public spending, $120 billion in public spending. The price of oil was high at this time. They had plenty of money, and they used it quite effectively, protected the home front, and they were safe. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, I would describe, that's the home front. Then it was what I would call the defensive perimeter, which was working to secure the survival and the stability of the kind of the home. I call it the defensive perimeter. You can call this the GCC +2, the GCC and the fellow monarchies. And this was done through a combination of political support, financial support, media support, and in one major case, military support. So in Kuwait, in Oman, in Jordan, and Morocco, you have an infusion of money which allows them to ride out the storm, to buy off dissent, and to basically find ways to increase the resilience of these threatened but not quite so wealthy monarchies. And then each of those countries does basically what it typically does as a way of buying off dissent. So Jordan and Morocco, they dissolve the parliament, they call new elections, they do some constitutional reforms, they co-opt part of the opposition, and basically they play the political game, and they survive, and as they always do, and they basically return politics fairly quickly to something quite not unlike what happened before the Arab Spring. So Morocco now, for instance, they have an Islamist party just won a re-election. They run the government, the Party of Justice and Development. They run the Moroccan government, but really the king runs Morocco, and it doesn't really matter all that much what the parliament does. This is Moroccan politics as normal. They survived, and then they moved on. Kuwait, Oman, Jordan, Morocco, pretty much the same story. Bahrain couldn't be solved in that way. And there you had an actual military intervention by the GCC. Saudi and Qatari troops roll across the causeway from Saudi Arabia in support of the Bahraini police, and they essentially physically and quite violently clear the streets of protesters, arrest a whole lot of people, torture a whole lot of people, and carry out large-scale sectarian repression, really at an extraordinarily high level, which is, in my opinion, has really deep and long-lasting implications for the stability and even the long-term viability of the monarchy of Bahrain. And that's something which I think people are paying very close attention to right now, because there's a large American naval base there, and it's a kind of an epicenter of a lot of this stuff. But this was all part of the defensive perimeter strategy, making sure that protests would not spread to those areas, and this was all largely accomplished by March. In other words, within 6 to 8 weeks of the Arab Spring uprisings, the defensive perimeter and the home front of the Gulf states and the monarchies was secured. What happened next was, it really depended on where the country was within the regional order. So the two major transitional states, Egypt and Tunisia, become the site of really extraordinarily interesting political warfare between the camps in the Gulf. And here's where the concert in the Gulf breaks down. So basically, the GCC was largely unified in protecting the home front and the defensive perimeter. They were not unified in the transitional states. Egypt and Tunisia become, in a sense, political battlefields between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, actually an alliance between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which was quite historically unusual, actually, how closely the Saudis and the Emiratis cooperated in this time period. Essentially what happens is, as Tunisia and Egypt move into elections, you end up with Qatar backing one large alliance, basically the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Ennahda, the Islamist party in Tunisia, along with a diverse group of leftists and secular activists who were associated with the uprisings. And the Saudis and the Emiratis end up backing coalitions of the old regime, the state, security services, the military, old elites, businessmen, and the like. And basically you end up with the Gulf states shaping and influencing the domestic politics of these two major transitional countries in extremely interesting ways. I'm not saying that they were able to determine outcomes. These were domestic political wars for the future of those countries, but the major coalitions were each aligned with regional coalitions, and you can't understand them without that. Most people look at Egypt and Tunisia, and what they see are two stories that go in the exact opposite direction. Egypt failed and Tunisia succeeded. And to a very large degree, that's true. In Egypt, the transition process ends with a military coup, an extraordinarily bloody repression which follows the military coup, and the reassertion of basically military rule and a fairly extreme form of violent autocracy, which is, I think, put Egypt on a very, very dangerous path. Tunisia avoids that fate. The major political powers come to a negotiated political agreement. They agree on the rules of the game. They put the constitution to a vote. It succeeds, and you get that all-important second election, peaceful rotation of power, and Tunisia, at least for now, had a successful democratic transition, whereas Egypt failed to do so. And from the point of view of comparative politics, this is right. From the point of view of regional politics, it's wrong. Because actually what happened in Tunisia and Egypt was almost the exact same trajectory. In the first elections after the revolutions, Islamist parties win in both Egypt and Tunisia, and they form governments in both Egypt and Tunisia. And in forming those governments, they essentially take their country, Egypt and Tunisia, out of the Saudi orbit and put it into the Qatari orbit. And they become not clients of Qatar, but aligned with Qatar, which is a major, almost unbelievable change in the case of Egypt in kind of regional geopolitics. After that, you see large-scale political polarization against the Islamist rule, which ends in both cases in the reinstallation of the old elite. In Egypt's case, by military force, and in Tunisia's case, by the voluntary surrender of power by the Islamists, who step down peacefully and hand off power to the UAE and Saudi-backed coalition of old elites known as Nida Tunis. So the outcome in regional geopolitical terms is the same, which is quite interesting, given that almost nobody sees it that way. So that's political warfare, basically playing the game of transitions. Yemen was very much part of the Saudi orbit, and the United States essentially handed off custody of the Yemeni transition to Saudi Arabia and the GCC. The United States was heavily involved in trying to broker the Yemeni transition, but this was a Saudi-led initiative from the start. Now, I would love to spend a lot of time talking about Yemen, but I want to kind of get to the end of this. But please ask me about Yemen. But the basic thrust of this is that I actually think that the Yemen transition was actually one of the better managed of the transitions in terms of how it was designed, in terms of getting Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, to step down, creating a process for large-scale national dialogue on the terms of a new constitution, and having a process towards new elections with a heavy role of the UN as the mediator for all of this. This was actually a pretty well-designed process. Unfortunately, it failed. And it failed at almost precisely the moment of the resolution of the national dialogue, creation of a new constitution. The Houthi movement in the north was unhappy with the terms of the new constitution, and they basically staged a coup. They seized power in Sana'a, the capital, and then they moved down to the south. The Saudis intervened militarily in response, and now we've had going on 18 months of fruitless, unresolvable military basically a war in Yemen with extraordinary humanitarian consequences. But so it's a failure and quite an unfortunate one. But that happens within, I would put Yemen within that rubric of political warfare. This was part of the transitional process which failed. So your failures are basically transitional failures, Yemen, Egypt, and Tunisia, provisional success. Then you get, that's all defense, right? Every country I've named so far was a pre-existing Saudi ally, and all of it was about defense. But there were two major countries where the uprisings were seen not as a threat, but as an opportunity: Libya and Syria. In both cases, Libya and Syria, the uprisings were challenging leaders who were outside of this Saudi-led coalition. Now, Libya had actually come in from the cold in 2003 and turned over its chemical weapons programs and was in the process of rehabilitation with the West, settled the Lockerbie terrorist incident and all of that. But from the point of view of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Gaddafi's sins were unforgivable. He had reportedly tried to have then Crown Prince Abdullah assassinated, and Abdullah never forgave him for that. No idea why. And Gaddafi had gone into an Arab summit hosted in Doha and made a really quite remarkably insulting speech, insulting his hosts in Doha, which the Emir of Qatar had never forgiven, which meant that when Gaddafi was threatened, he had no friends. Nobody in the Arab world was going to do this defensive perimeter stuff that I was just talking about. Instead, this was seen as an opportunity to get rid of a hated rival. Qatar and Saudi Arabia, then, UAE later, had an almost really quite unprecedented role in taking Libya into what it became. Now, the primary responsibility, of course, is Gaddafi's. Gaddafi was the first Arab leader to meet a large-scale mass mobilization with military force. He was the first one to use his full military power against protesters, butchering people, and turning it into a bloodbath quickly. That was Gaddafi's decision, and we can talk about why if you'd like, but the point is that Gaddafi he was the first of the Arab leaders to turn a peaceful uprising into a bloodbath. This was in mid to late February of 2011. The response from the Arab League was nothing less than extraordinary, because the Arab League famously is unable to do anything. They can't agree on anything. They're completely useless on pretty much everything. But they agreed remarkably quickly to come out against Gaddafi and to lobby for a Security Council resolution for an intervention against Gaddafi. The British and the French jumped on board this, and Obama was dragged into this fairly reluctantly. But in a remarkably rapid period of time, in mid-March, you got a UN Security Council resolution, which Russia agreed to, on a military intervention for humanitarian protection to protect Benghazi, which was under imminent threat of attack. I was in favor of this at the time. The first chapter of the book is all about my rethinking of that moment, and I encourage you to read it. I'm happy to talk about it if you'd like, why I've rethought my support for that intervention. But I thought it was necessary at the moment, given what was going on and given the context. But what happened was, of course, that you begin an air campaign which saved Benghazi, and it did save Benghazi, but then quickly turned from humanitarian protection into a campaign for regime change, as NATO essentially becomes the air force for the rebels, and special forces from various countries become embedded with the rebels, and it turns into a civil war with the West on one side and the major Arab states all backing one side. But this is where the rivalry came in, because the United States and the West was not going to put troops on the ground, thank God. Instead, they had to fight through local militias on the ground. And what ended up happening was that each militia on the ground drew on a different external source of support. There were Qatari-backed militias, and Emirati-backed militias, and Egyptian-backed militias, and each of them benefited from this independent source of power and funding, which was great when they were all unified in getting rid of Gaddafi, but became an enormous problem after Gaddafi fell. After Gaddafi fell, and remember, it took like 6 months for this to work, which was a very long time, but after he fell, these militias, of course they didn't give up their weapons. Of course they didn't give up their source of power. And they became the real power brokers on the ground across Libya. Many people will now say that you can't judge the outcome in Libya by the initial, you can say that the intervention succeeded, but the subsequent transition failed. And I think this is fundamentally wrong, because I think that the way the intervention was fought through these local militias is what created the conditions for the failure of democratic consolidation which followed. The militias, which now wield power across Libya, backed by their respective external sponsors, were created by the war, and they are the major legacy of that war. And so Libya, and its failure, and it has failed, it's a tragic failure, is in many ways, it's a unique case, but it's also a very instructive one for thinking through this type of intervention. Okay, I've been talking for a bit longer than I expected, and haven't even gotten to Syria yet. So I'm going to go to Syria now and then wrap this up so we have some time for questions. Syria was the epicenter of all of these trends. Syria began as an Arab uprising, just like all the others. The conspiracy theories now put out about how this was jihadist, front all from the beginning, I think are just wrong. I know too many of the activists involved, many of them now dead, to fall for the idea that they were somehow simply Qatari proxies, or that the protests were filmed on Doha sound stages, or the stuff that you hear in the Arab media these days. This was an Arab Spring-style uprising, and it began very small in the cities, and then it didn't really seem to be going very far until in the middle of March, at the exact same time that NATO begins its military campaign in Libya, a police captain in the south of Syria decides to take a couple of kids who had scrawled anti-Bashar graffiti and basically take them, torture them, kill them, do unspeakable things to them, dump their bodies on their family's doorstep. Instead of intimidating people, this then led to outrage. Protests begin, and they snowball very, very quickly, especially in the rural areas outside of the power corridors of Damascus and Aleppo. And very quickly, Syria is starting to look something like Libya, something like the other Arab Spring countries, where you have large parts of the country quickly falling out of the control of the central state. Assad responded to this in some ways like the Arab monarchies. He offered a new constitution, he offered some political reforms. Nobody trusted him or believed him, as they shouldn't have. No reason to take it seriously, and most people didn't. He also responded with carefully gradated violence. That's what most people didn't quite get. This wasn't like Libya, where he immediately unleashed his full military power. It was a gradated violence, trying to make sure that he was fighting a war against this uprising without triggering international intervention, staying beneath the threshold that Qaddafi had so flagrantly crossed. And so the violence starts at a small scale, often carried out by plainclothes thugs, often carried out in remote locations, but then beginning to spiral and spiral and spiral. The uprising, which began as a civil uprising, begins responding with some types of violence as early as the summer of 2011. Jihadists come over the border from Iraq and establish what becomes known as Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. They begin organizing and setting up shop in kind of May, June, July of 2011, but they keep a very low profile. A group of Syrian army defectors form the Free Syrian Army in the summer of 2011, but they don't command a great deal of support either on the ground or politically. But basically, from June until roughly January, June 2011 to January 2012, I spent a lot of time on this period in my book, there's a really important, highly consequential debate among Syrians in the opposition about whether and how to militarize. People forget now that the Syrian National Council, which was the political oversight, the political body overseeing the Syrian revolution, its slogan for up until early 2012 had three no's: no to sectarianism, no to international intervention, and no to militarization. They were determined that this remain a peaceful uprising, in part because they knew, and many of the intellectuals associated with the opposition knew, that if it became a war, they would be profoundly disadvantaged, that the regime was simply stronger than they were militarily, but also that turning it into an insurgency would fundamentally change the nature of the uprising, changing it from a civic uprising into an insurgency. In insurgencies, it's not the doctors and the dentists that win, it's the warlords. It's the guys who can control the guns. And this debate largely was settled in early 2012 with the failure of the UN Security Council to approve a resolution which would have authorized international action in Syria. After the failure of that resolution, you saw the fairly rapid militarization of the uprising. The United States began debating the arming of the insurgency publicly in the late summer in 2012, but by that point, the ship had long since sailed. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey began heavily arming the insurgency, as did Jordan, in February of 2012. And the transformation from a civic uprising into an insurgency was well underway by the spring of 2012. Indeed, by the midsummer of 2012, many people thought this insurgency was about to win. They were moving south towards Damascus. To this day, unexplained explosion killed most of Assad's security leadership. There was a very widespread sense in the summer of 2012 that the insurgents were about to win the war, Assad was about to fall, and indeed, people were heavily involved in post-Assad planning, but it didn't happen. Assad survived. And actually, we can go back and talk about this if you want. I think people always radically exaggerated Assad's vulnerability and exaggerated the likely success of the opposition. I think that the Assad's strength was much greater than people believed, and people were not paying attention to the resonance of his message with large sectors of the Syrian public who felt deeply threatened and afraid of victory by the insurgents, fed on a diet of propaganda and fed by a whole lot of other things. But suffice it to say, so we can move to the end of this horrible story, is that instead of falling, Assad survived, and then what was set in motion was a process that I basically described as basically the climbing of the escalatory ladder. Each side had external patrons, Assad had Iran, Russia, Hezbollah. The rebels had Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United States, Britain, France, Jordan, pretty much Israel, pretty much everybody else. And this support was kind of doled out in such a way that neither side was ever able to lose. If Assad looked like he was about to fall, he would receive an infusion of support, either indirect or direct. Hezbollah came in to fight his battles for him. Iran sent forces in to fight his battles for him. And then most recently, Russia has intervened militarily to fight his battles for him. And every time the rebels look like they're about to lose, they get massive infusions of different types and different quantities of weaponry and funds, which ensure that they survive and are able to continue fighting. Which means it's been basically a strategic stalemate since early 2012. But with each step up the escalatory ladder at much, much greater human cost and human suffering. So that's how we've gotten to a point today with people guess. Nobody really knows. It's kind of hard to count in the middle of one of the worst civil wars of modern history. But the official numbers are 500,000 dead, 13 million refugees, and the basically consolidation of a civil war economy, which is unlikely to end anytime soon. Political science studies of this type of civil war, where you have fragmented opposition, multiple external actors, what we call in political science literature, we call them veto players, basically anyone who's capable of acting to prevent the consolidation of a peace deal. This type of civil war typically lasts about a decade, and Syria is an extreme type of this type of civil war. The number and diversity of veto players is one of the most complex and most veto-ridden civil wars that modern history has ever seen. I wouldn't put money on it ending in the next decade. Even after Assad falls, which I think he probably will at some point, the civil war will likely continue, except that you'll have a new government in power with external support, but it will be weak, unable to establish its authority, still facing a jihadist insurgency, a rump Assadist insurgency, and the civil war. I mean, this is likely to look like Afghanistan moving from the 1980s into the 1990s. And this is a very, very grim future, but it's hard to see any alternative future. Now, many people in Washington will say, unless the United States intervenes, except that I don't believe the United States, by intervening, can make any substantial or fundamental difference in this. We can be more involved in it. We can strengthen our proxies, thereby inviting Russia to do the same for their proxies. We can be involved, but I don't think we can stop this through anything other than some kind of negotiated agreement from the top down between U.S. and Russia, which is what John Kerry's been trying to do for the last 2 years, and getting nowhere with, because nobody is ready to stop fighting, nobody trusts the other side, and nobody is going to lay down their guns. And so I foresee a very, very grim future for Syria, and thus for the entire Middle East, because Syria is at the center of the Middle East, and it is radiating out all of its trauma. Millions of refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and increasingly out into Europe. Sectarianism, jihadism, all of the traumas and horrors associated with the civil war are reshaping the region in ways that it's almost impossible to fully comprehend or contemplate or to predict the outcome. So that is a grim way to end, and of that I have no illusions. Now, I promised to end on some ray of hope, and I think I've talked myself into a bit of a corner in that, because it's hard to find. I'm not an optimist on the Middle East right now, except in the most kind of large trend way, in that the hope that I still have for the region really does lie in the fact that all of the grievances which underlay the original Arab uprising, and all of the shifts in the balance of power between state and society, which enabled the Arab uprisings, are greater today than they were in 2010. To just take really simple things, if you look at every economic indicator in the Middle East, they are worse today than they were in 2010. Whether you're talking about poverty, whether you're talking about inequality, whether you're talking about foreign exchange balances, whether any indicator you want. In kind of the political instability forecasting, I'm involved in several groups that are involved in this. every red light is blinking. I mean, in Egypt right now, I mean, they can't even buy wheat. They can't even issue wheat tenders because nobody believes they'll be able to pay their bills. They've devalued their currency multiple times. I mean, this is an astonishingly bad situation, exactly the sort of thing which lends itself to political instability. And with the low oil prices likely locked in for the foreseeable future, that's likely to continue and to spread everywhere. Add on to that what I said a few minutes ago, refugees, sectarianism, the cascading effects of war, state failure. None of these regimes are nearly as stable as they want you to believe they are. At the same time, the shift of power from states towards societies continues to grow. The Middle East has one of the youngest populations anywhere in the Middle East, and while many of those youth now are refugees, destitute, and living under horrible, disempowered conditions, there are many other young cosmopolitan youth who are simply empowered in ways that we've never seen before. They have experience of political victory, they know how to use the internet and how to organize, and they're just waiting for the next episode. They're just waiting for the next installment, and I think they're going to get it sooner rather than later. So that might not be hope in the sense of good outcomes, but it is hope in the sense of saying that this story isn't over yet, and basically the way that I put it in the book was to say that we know, if you accept my long trajectory, my long arc view of what's going on, then we know that we are in the second movie of the trilogy, right? We know that we're in the second movie. So we're in The Empire Strikes Back right now, or we're in Attack of the Clones, I guess, if anyone remembers that. What we don't know is whether the next movie is Return of the Jedi or Revenge of the Sith, right? We don't know if the bad guys are going to win or the good guys are going to win. We don't know how the trilogy ends, but I do think there's going to be a third movie, and it's going to be coming out sooner than people think. Okay, so I promised to talk about the election, but I'm already depressed enough about Syria, so I'll just stop there. But feel free to ask me if that's something that interests you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. This is great, thank you. So we have 2 microphones, and we'll take questions alternately in either of those. I will ask those who are asking questions to ask concise questions and not engage in any sort of commentary. We have about 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. Please, sir.
Okay, I do want to hear about the election and tie it into whatever advice you might give whatever future president we have in terms of how they should and not necessarily how they will deal with the Middle East.
Excellent question. Thank you. Well, just very briefly, let me say that I have come around, I've been forced into the notion that presidents matter in terms of setting policy, but structures matter too, and the ability of presidents to change things is less than we often think it is. So think about how George W. Bush came into office determined to have a humble foreign policy, pulling back from the region, and within 2 years was overseeing one of the most interventionist foreign policies in history. Or think about how Obama came into office determined to retrench and pull back, and is currently fighting, I believe, 5 wars in the Middle East. So in a sense, the next president will try and change things, and then is likely to fail at changing them. And so I think that ultimately, whoever it is, Clinton or Trump, is going to come in and is going to promise big dramatic changes, is going to enact those changes because presidents have that power, and then those initiatives will likely fail and they'll revert back to the mean, kind of what Obama's doing right now, what Bush ended up doing in the end of his term, kind of what structure dictates. Between the two of them, I think with Clinton, it's fairly clear, where she has a long history, a long track record. Her advisors are well known. I think you're going to see Clinton wanting to oversee the restoration of America's alliances and the old regional order. She'll want to try and kind of rebuild alliances with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. She will take a more forceful and more kind of rhetorically forceful approach to things like Syria. You probably expect to see the announcement of a no-fly zone, some airstrikes, some demonstration that she's different from Obama. But I think she'd likely hold on to the Iran deal. Most of her top advisors on foreign policy were involved in negotiating it. It's highly unlikely that she would want to tear it up. I think you're likely to see, you're going to get largely what she says she's going to give. I mean, she has a long track record. Her views are pretty well known. And I think ultimately, despite the rhetorical flourishes, this is going to end up looking just like Obama's policies, because she's going to try and rebuild relations with Israel and with the Gulf states. But actually, our interests have fundamentally diverged. We have different views of the appropriate role of the United States in the region, the value of the Iran deal, the desirability of Israeli-Palestinian peace. So I would guess that Hillary Clinton will be hugging and kissing Benjamin Netanyahu in February of 2017, and 6 months later, they're going to be having a big public fight over new settlements. And the Saudis will welcome Clinton with open arms and welcome this new era in Gulf cooperation with the United States. And within a few months, they're going to be complaining that she's not doing enough in Syria or not doing enough to confront Iran. And I think it's going to look a lot like it is now. Interestingly, with Trump, I think you might see the same thing, but in the reverse direction. I mean, his policy is very difficult to discern because he doesn't really say very much, and his advisors are not people who are well known. But I think when you try and read through what he has said about the Middle East, there's a couple themes that come through. One is his skepticism about existing alliances. I think that whereas Clinton would come in seeking to rebuild alliances, he's likely to come in trying to make them more transactional and more in the sense of, okay, what can you do for me? And that's the way he's approached every single alliance, whether it's NATO, and I think that this is a reason why Saudi Arabia, the Israelis are quite worried about him, I think, because they're not sure what he's going to do with those existing alliances. One of his chief advisors, General Flynn, has articulated a view of kind of a much more ramped up global war on terror. I think you would see kind of an escalation of kind of the drone strikes and kind of militarized war on terror. That seems like something, and kind of this general anti-Islamic, anti-Islamist central thing, which is quite interesting. But you might have noticed in the last debate that, and this is actually one of the most interesting things about what Trump has been saying, is that he includes Iran in that coalition of states that are fighting against ISIS. And the idea that he might break with Republican orthodoxy and actually view Iran as a useful partner against ISIS is actually quite unusual for a Republican candidate. And that's something which I think people are watching quite carefully. But I think that what you would see with Trump is the same thing in reverse. He's going to have to staff his administration. He's going to draw on the Republican foreign policy establishment. They're going to come in. They're going to they're going to restrain his kind of more novel ideas. The region will push back on him. His ideas won't work. And I think that he also will be pulled back to an equilibrium. And so it's actually quite interesting. This is not I'm trying to give as nonpartisan an answer as I can, and I don't work for either candidate, and I don't want to. I look at it and I basically say that what you're likely to see is this attempt to change things in this direction or this direction, and then being dragged back to the center by events.
Yes, you briefly...
I'll try to give shorter answers from now on.
You briefly mentioned the sectarian conflict on the south side of the Gulf, which doesn't get in the papers and reports very much. Given the not terribly discriminate bombing in Yemen that's been going on, it's not hard to see a scenario where that got ugly pretty fast. And in a petroleum operation area, leaving the world going, where did that come from? Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's already gotten quite ugly. In fact, just the other day, there was a quite unprecedented missile attack on an American destroyer off the coast of Yemen, and the United States responded by shelling 3 radar stations on the Yemeni coast, which is, really, people think this might be a sign of U.S. entry into the war, but I actually doubt it. I think this is going to be more like, basically the defense of, basically you don't do that. But I think that essentially, when I look at what's happening in Yemen right now, I think you have to break apart two very different things. One is the Saudi entry into the war, and then there's what's happened since then. And I think that you could, I don't agree with it, but you can make a case for the Saudi entry into the war. The Houthis and the former president, they had actually seized power in the capital city. They were taking the whole country. Saudis viewed this as a mortal threat, and they felt they had to do something. And that's understandable. And I think the United States was not the decision maker there, but they were willing to let it go at a time when they desperately needed Saudi support for the Iran deal, and they figured they should defer to Saudi preferences on Yemen. But what's happened since, I think, is less defensible. That what you've had now is, it's been very clear for well over a year that the military campaign is not leading towards any kind of political solution, and there's no military solution, no political solution, and it's just this relentless ongoing bombardment of one of the poorest countries on earth. And you have a situation right now where, according to the UN, something like a third of the country is facing famine conditions, water sanitation, agriculture, bridges, electrical plants, hospitals. They've all been devastated. And there's like nothing left to bomb, and yet the bombing continues. And I think that's why you're beginning to see a mobilization against the war. It's really quite extraordinary what you saw in Congress a few months ago when Chris Murphy and a number of other senators were calling for an end to arms sales to Saudi Arabia until it resolved the war in Yemen. That's almost unprecedented in my experience. But it's hard to see how you end it. I think that most people who initially supported that war would probably like to see it ended, but nobody knows how to. The state has collapsed, neither side is willing to compromise, and it's just nearly hopeless. The one thing about this, I had to write a memo about these various wars, about which ones are likely to end first. And Yemen is actually the one that could end first, simply because it's the only one of the current wars where there's a single party that could make a decision and end the war. Saudi Arabia could decide to stop the war. I don't think they will, but they could. That's not true in Syria. It's not true in Libya. So that at least gives some hope that if Saudi Arabia could find a face-saving exit, that they might be willing to de-escalate. And that I think is what diplomats are trying to work on. Sorry.
Yes, you used the term Arab Spring, and I think that's probably a Western invention. I'm not really sure that there's even an Arabic term for that. So in that sense, if this is involvement of the West in what's going on there, in that sense, Obama's policy of non-involvement is probably correct. And perhaps even his definition of the Islamic State as a JV team, which is probably a temporary aberration, is probably correct. Would you comment on that?
So in my book, I actually use the term Arab uprising, not Arab Spring. And I think Intifada actually is. I've heard many of my Egyptian and Arab friends use that term for it. It was the one that I liked the best. The Arab Spring came in popular currency, and I unfortunately seem to have played a role in coining the term in an article that I published where I basically said, don't call it the Arab Spring. But I was the first one to use the term Arab Spring, and then it keeps getting attributed to me as in a piece I wrote for Foreign Policy. So I don't like the term either. But I do think that it was something real, not something which I don't think it was something that like Western observers kind of imagined or projected. I think this was a very real thing. I mean, there were millions of people in the streets demanding political change. That's a very real thing, whatever we call it. I think that Obama early on saw the hope for such a transformation. Most people have forgotten the speech that he gave in May of 2011 when he actually gave this really important speech where he tried to align the United States with the Arab uprisings. He equated it with the civil rights movement. He talked about the United States being on the right side of the moral arc of history. And he tried extremely hard to help to try and shepherd the Egyptian, especially Egyptian, also Tunisian, but really the Egyptian democratic democratic transition, and to the point that I would say that by the spring of 2013, it often seemed like Ambassador Patterson was the only person in Egypt who was interested in a democratic process anymore. The polarization between the two sides had become so great that she was like shouting into the wind when she talked about adherence to the democratic process and institutions and everything. I do think, though, that two things that you said I think are right. One is that, in a sense, Obama cut his losses, especially after the Egyptian coup. And by the summer of 2013, Egypt's military coup was devastating to American hopes for democratic change, and Syria and Libya had both gone down this road of becoming these horrible, tragic, escalating civil wars. And I think that at that point, Obama, who is a notoriously unsentimental person, basically cut his losses, saying, we tried to help this happen. It failed. We can't do anything anymore, and we're going to stop wasting our time trying in a very real way. And instead turned to focus on things which could be done, like the nuclear agreement with Iran, which then becomes the main focus of American diplomacy in that period and ends up in success. I also think that Obama was, in my opinion, correct about having a hands-off approach to a lot of this stuff. I mean, I think that he basically viewed correctly that these were not things which were driven by the United States and not in America's ability to shape. He didn't walk away from it right away, though. I mean, like I said, he spent like 2 years where the State Department, the White House, USAID, government agencies were trying very hard to nurture the transitions, but they failed to do so. Again, largely for indigenous reasons and internal reasons. But at that point, I think that, like I said, basically cut his losses. Mm-hmm.
Last month, Vali Nasser addressed this forum, and he made the following statement. If oil stays at or below $50 a barrel in the coming years, we're likely to see regime change in one or more petrostates in the Persian Gulf. Do you agree? Why or why not?
I totally agree. That's kind of what I was saying before. And so oil prices might not stay below $50 a barrel, and every country has their own break-even price. And for some, they can get by quite nicely on $50 a barrel oil, but others, like Kuwait, need a much higher price, $80, $90 a barrel. All of them have quite robust sovereign wealth funds. It's not like they're Egypt, where they can't pay their bills tomorrow. But looking down the longer road, their political economies are entirely based on the notion that the state is the generator and the distributor of wealth. And so the Saudi Deputy Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is overseeing this very ambitious campaign to try and transform the Saudi economy away from oil, Vision 2030. And it's impossible. It can't be done because the entire political system and the entire economy is structured around it being an oil distributive state. There's no productive. You don't have an independent middle class. You don't have strong industries, and you can't in rentier states that are dominated by oil. So I think that not in the sense of tomorrow you're going to see these states collapse because of low oil price, but the process of trying to adapt to that is going to be enormously disruptive. So again, most of them, like the UAE and Qatar, are fine. I mean, their wealth is in other areas. Kuwait is very, very interesting because of its much more developed and I think quite interesting political institutions that they've developed over the years. The two that I worry about the most are Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. I think Bahrain is largely a non-viable state at this point, and it's extremely unstable. But Saudi Arabia is the one that has had, to me, at least a bright yellow light flashing for quite some time. Because of the ongoing, the Sunni-Shia divide, because of the ongoing leadership succession issues, the way the royal succession is structured is extremely destabilizing, with the deputy crown prince basically, sitting behind the crown prince, but the deputy crown prince is the son of the aging and dying king, and so it creates a very perverse set of dynamics there. low oil prices, and then kind of the ongoing problems of a state which is literally the most wired country on earth. And one of my favorite statistics, Saudi Arabia has the highest per capita consumption of YouTube videos of any country in the world. And yet they have some of the fiercest and harshest control over the public sphere, of public space of any country in the world. And it seems like something's got to give at some point. So yeah, that's kind of my read of how the low oil prices are likely to affect stability, and it's not good.
This is going to be the last question.
Don't you believe the US and European wars, invasions, and death and destruction since January 17, 1991, and subsequent wars have led to the current anarchy that it is in the Middle East? And one point that you emphasized on League of Arab States coming on the side of Gaddafi, but you see there is an article in the League of Arab States that they cannot allow a foreign force to wage a war in an Arab country unless the majority voted for that assistance. And that's what the Americans and the Europeans did in 1991. They hijacked the League of Arab States headquarters from Tunisia to Cairo, so that the countries who were against the war, they did not go attend that. And that's the biggest problem.
Did you ask the question?
Yes, it was. I did ask him a question. Is it the US and the European caused the current crisis there, sir? Thank you.
No, I don't think the U.S. and Europe caused the current crisis, but the U.S. In particular shaped the regional order and supported the states against which the uprisings were largely directed. And I think that actually is one of the most interesting and important dynamics there, which is that at the same time that Obama, and I would say a significant portion of Americans, wanted to support the move towards democratization and the popular uprising, those uprisings were against American allies for the most part, and they were directed against an American-led regional order, which had been created, established, and sustained over decades. And so trying to manage that, I think, was something which was extraordinarily difficult for the United States. It's a familiar problem, trying to balance values and interests, but in this case, it was particularly intense. And I think that the willingness of the Obama administration to kind of support and actually even embrace the Egyptian democratic transition was quite an extraordinary decision. It's not one which previous administrations had made, and it's one which I think we're still kind of seeing some of the aftershocks and ramifications from. But I'm not trying to argue that the United States was irrelevant to any of these processes. It's central to the regional order. But I also don't want to take away the reality that the uprisings themselves were not created in Washington. These were the product of people who were frustrated by decades of misrule, corruption, tyranny, and basically mismanagement of their societies. And the United States probably would love to be able to bring millions of people out into the streets for whatever reason, but it really can't. That's not what was going on there. This was an indigenous uprising against a failed regional system and failed governments, which the United States was basically trying, effectively or ineffectively, depending on your point of view, to navigate. And where we are right now is kind of the reverse, almost like the flip side of what you saw constructed in the early 1990s. You don't have a regional order now, you have regional disorder. And the United States has, in my view, quite dwindling opportunities and mechanisms by which to influence those outcomes, with strained alliances and diverging preferences from its alliances, and all these wars which it can't resolve. So despite, not despite, but as I was saying, with the next administration, there's going to be a lot on that administration's plate, and they're going to have not a huge repertoire of tools with which to change it, and I don't envy them as they try and grapple with it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark, for this timely and engaging discussion. We have books available for purchase at the back, and Mark will be here to sign your books. We thank him for this great discussion, and we will have a reception here. So if you want to stay around and enjoy yourselves, thank you. Good night. So